Part 1. The Man Who Captured Eternity in a Single Line. They say there was a winter night in Paris when Alfons Maria Mucha saved a legend. It was 1894. The city was drowning in fog, the streets wet with melted snow. At the Théâtre de la Renaissance, Sarah Bernhardt, the greatest actress of the age, was pacing like a caged lioness. Her new play Gismonda was set to premiere in days, but the posters, the art, the face of her triumph? They didn't exist. Every artist she'd called had failed her. And then, almost by accident, she reached for a name no one knew. An obscure Moravian illustrator, penniless, quiet, with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of centuries. When Mucha arrived at the theater, the smell of paint and stale perfume hung in the air. He bowed awkwardly, clutching his worn sketchbook. Sarah gave him one night. And before dawn he had changed art forever. The poster he delivered was unlike anything Paris had ever seen. Towering, luminous, a river of flowing lines and dreamlike colors. Her face framed by an almost holy halo of flowers and mosaic patterns. It didn't scream for attention, it whispered, and the whole city leaned in to listen. By morning, Parisians were stealing the posters from the walls. By the end of the week, Alfons Maria Mucha had a name. By the end of the month he had a legend. But how did a boy from a small Moravian village, a boy who once sketched saints in the back of a cold church to keep his fingers from freezing, end up here in the golden heart of Paris, reshaping beauty itself? To understand that, we have to go back. Back before the fame, before the flowing hair and jeweled gowns of his muses. Back to a land of snow, bells and smoke, where a child named Alphonse dreamed not of glory, but of light. Moravia, 1860s. Alfons was small, its winters long. The young Mucha's world was a patchwork of candlelight and cold stone chapels, of the earthy smell of fresh-cut wood from his father's carpentry shop, of folk songs that carried in the wind like prayers. His earliest memory was not of a face but of color, the deep blues of the Virgin Mary painted in the church near his home. Alphonse would spend hours sitting on the hard wooden pews, tracing the outlines of saints in his mind. He could hear the slow drip of wax on the altar, the way the dust danced in the rays of sun. Even then he understood something that many grown men never do, that beauty, when it touches you, leaves a mark you can never wash away. But his family was poor. Art was not a career, it was a luxury. His mother hoped he might find steady work. His father, though proud of his skill, warned him of hunger. Yet the boy kept drawing. In the margins of books, in the sawdust of the workshop floor, even in the frost on the windows. The first blow came when he was barely a teenager. His voice, once pure enough to lead the church choir, cracked and vanished. He was no longer the golden boy of the parish. The music that had carried him was gone, and in its place, silence. So he turned to his hands. At 15 he left home for Brno, working as a decorative painter for theater sets. The air smelled of glue and grease paint. Backstage was a jungle of costumes, shadows and whispered drama. He learned speed, discipline, and the art of making illusions look real. But he wanted more. Something lasting, something that would not be torn down after a show. And then rejection. When he applied to the Academy of Fine Arts in Prague, they told him flatly, "You have no talent." It was the kind of wound that could end a life before it began. But Alphonse didn't stop. He took jobs painting portraits for wealthy families, drawing advertising labels for products he couldn't afford, and decorating churches in small villages. He worked in the cold, sometimes without enough to eat, his breath fogging the air as he painted gilded halos on ceilings that dripped with moisture. And yet, in those quiet churches under the dim candlelight, he found his language. The curve of a saint's robe. The delicate arch of a hand in prayer. The infinite patience of a single, unbroken line. This was where Alfons Mucha began to understand something dangerous. That beauty could be both sacred and seductive, that a face could be both a prayer and a temptation. By the time he set foot in Vienna and later in Paris, he carried with him not just the skills of an artisan, but the soul of a man who had been told no and answered with "Watch me." And in that foggy Paris winter, when Sarah Bernhardt called, he was ready. Part 2. The Gospel According to Mucha. Paris, 1895. Overnight, the Gismonda poster had turned Alfons Maria Mucha into a sensation. Critics called it a revelation. The public called it a miracle. But in the cafés of Montmartre, where smoke curled in the lamplight and absinthe glowed green in the glass, people whispered a different name, Le Style Mucha. It was everywhere, and yet nowhere. It wasn't just an art style, it was a spell. Women in flowing gowns, their hair like rivers of gold, framed by halos of flowers and geometry. Jewel tones that seemed to hum in the air. Every line deliberate, every curve alive. Inside Mucha's studio, the world was both chaos and cathedral. Tall windows spilled cold Paris light onto a floor littered with sketches, rolls of canvas and half-empty cups of black coffee gone bitter with neglect. A harp sat in one corner, dusty from disuse, but still beautiful like one of his muses frozen in time. The smell was a mix of linseed oil, paper, and the faint perfume of the models who came and went. Sometimes he worked for hours without moving, his hand tracing those endless lines with almost religious devotion. Other times he would leap to his feet, pacing like a man in prayer, muttering in Czech, French, or the strange hybrid of both that only he seemed to understand. Sarah Bernhard became his patron, his friend, his constant challenge. She demanded perfection, and he delivered. For La de Meux Camelius, he painted her as an icon wrapped in lilies. For Lorenzaccio, he turned her into a warrior saint, fierce and unbreakable. He made her immortal and she made him indispensable. But with every success came a quiet unease. The posters sold. The commissions poured in. Champagne flowed in Montparnasse. And yet, Mucha feared he was becoming a decorator of beauty, not a prophet of it. One evening at a gathering in the smoky Salon de la Rue Caulaincourt, a fellow artist leaned in and said, "Alphonse, your women are divine. But are they yours or Paris's?" Mucha smiled politely, but the question cut deep. Because the truth was, many of those women didn't exist. They were visions, part saint, part temptation, stitched together from memory, imagination and longing. They were not portraits. They were prayers. The turn of the century brought change. Paris was still the heart of the world, but Mucha felt the pull of something larger, something beyond theater posters and perfume ads. In his mind, he carried the image of his homeland, Moravia, with its rolling hills and songs sung in the shadow of oppression. And he had a dangerous idea, to tell the story of the Slavic people not in words, but in a series of paintings so vast they would outlive him. This became his obsession, the Slav epic. 20 massive canvases, some taller than 2 men, depicting centuries of history, faith and struggle. It was not glamorous work. There were no rich clients begging for it, no fashionable critics waiting to praise it. It was slow, punishing and expensive. But to Mucha it was the truth. Still, the world wanted le style Mucha. He was pulled between 2 lives. The celebrated Parisian master, adored for his golden, ethereal women. And the exiled son of Moravia, dreaming of a legacy carved in the soul of his people. In 1904 he sailed to America. To the journalists in New York he was the master of Art Nouveau. To the millionaires he was a designer for their salons, their libraries, their staircases. He accepted their commissions, but at night in hotel rooms smelling faintly of cigar smoke, he sketched the outlines of kings, saints and warriors for the epic no one yet understood. And always, there was that feeling, that art, if it is to matter, must serve something greater than fashion. In the salons he was polite. In the studio he was relentless. And in his heart, the lines he drew were no longer just decoration. They were scripture. Part 3, The Weight of Eternity. It was 1910 when Alfons Mucha returned to his homeland. But the Moravia he found was not the one of his childhood songs. It was restless, tense. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was creaking like an old wooden ship in a rising storm. And in the middle of it all, he began the work that had haunted him for years. The Slav epic. The studio he built in Zbiro Castle was like nothing else in Europe. A cavernous hall, ceilings high enough to swallow the echo of footsteps, smelled of turpentine and raw canvas. Light poured in from tall windows, spilling over ladders, ropes and the massive, unfinished murals, so huge they looked like fragments of some ancient cathedral wall ripped from time itself. On the floor, jars of pigments lined up like soldiers. Ochres, vermilions, ultramarine crushed from precious stones. Brushes the size of brooms leaned against the walls. And in the center, Mucha moving between his work with the slow precision of a priest performing a ritual. But outside those walls, Europe was spiraling into chaos. 1914, Sarajevo. The first shot. And soon, war drowned the continent in blood. The world had no time for beauty. Canvas shipments were delayed, paints grew scarce and the letters from friends came edged in black, each one a name gone forever. Still Mucha painted. He painted scenes of unity, of faith, of struggle. He painted as if each stroke could hold back the tide of death. To those who visited he seemed calm, almost serene. But at night he dreamed of burning cities and faceless soldiers. His wife, Maruska, once found him standing in the dark hall of the castle, staring at an unfinished mural, whispering in Czech, "If I stop now, they will win." The war ended. Empires collapsed. Czechoslovakia was born. And for a brief moment, Mucha's work seemed prophetic, a visual hymn for a new nation. But the world was already changing again. The Jazz Age had no patience for saints and warriors. The young called Art Nouveau old-fashioned, a relic of their parents' time. Critics dismissed his epic as nationalistic propaganda. The man who had once defined Parisian modernity was now accused of being outdated. He ignored them. By 1928, after 2 decades of relentless labor, Mucha finally unveiled the Slav epic in Prague. 20 vast paintings, each telling a chapter of Slavic history. He offered them as a gift to the Czech people. It should have been his triumph. But the unveiling was quiet, almost awkward. The modernists smirked. Newspapers gave it a few columns. For Mucha, it was like placing his heart on the altar and finding the church empty. And then came the shadow of another war. 1939. The German occupation of Czechoslovakia. Nazi banners draped over the very buildings where Mucha's art once hung. His works, with their Slavic themes, were suddenly dangerous. One morning the Gestapo came for him. Neighbors watched from their windows as the frail old artist was led away, his thin frame swallowed by a black coat, his head held high. They interrogated him for days. He spoke quietly, answered what he could, refused what he must. No one knows exactly what was said in that room, only that when he returned home he was pale, coughing, and much weaker. By spring of 1939, pneumonia had set in. Lying in his Prague apartment, he could hear church bells in the distance. On his bedside table was a sketch for an unfinished work. A woman in flowing robes, her hands lifted toward the sky, her eyes full of both grief and hope. Some say he whispered, "The world will see her someday." Others say he said nothing at all. In July, Alfons Maria Mucha was gone. Outside, the city marched under foreign flags. Inside, the walls of his home still glowed with sunlight and the faint scent of linseed oil. Final, the eternal line. Today, Alfons Mucha's name is whispered with a kind of reverence. His posters, once pinned to the damp walls of Parisian streets, now hang in climate-controlled museums. The faces of his ethereal women, their hair swirling into impossible patterns, their eyes fixed on some horizon beyond us, gaze out from books, calendars, coffee mugs. But this is not how he imagined his immortality. To Mucha, art was never decoration. It was prayer. It was prophecy. Every curve of a line, every halo of gold, was an attempt to bridge the human and the divine, to remind us that beauty was not frivolous but necessary. In Prague, the Slav epic sleeps still, its 20 titanic visions rolled and stored, waiting. They say when the paintings are unrolled, you can still smell the decades-old linseed oil, still see the fingerprints of the man who pressed his soul into them. And when you stand before them, the figures seem to move, not in the way of illusion, but as if history itself is shifting, turning its face toward you. Some nights, in the empty galleries, guards have claimed strange things. A faint humming in Czech as if someone were softly singing an old folk song. The scent of fresh paint, though no brush has touched the canvas in 80 years. And once, a shadow in the shape of a tall man, standing with his hands clasped behind his back, gazing at his own work as though judging if it is truly finished. Perhaps it never will be. Perhaps the line he began in the small Moravian church, the line he carried through the glitter of Paris and the smoke of war, is still being drawn, through our own lives, through every act of creation, through every choice to preserve beauty in the face of destruction. If you ever find yourself in front of a Mucha, whether it's a grand mural or a simple poster, look closely. Not just at the colors, not just at the curves. Listen. You might hear the echo of a man whispering from another century. If I stop now, they will win. And in that moment you will understand. Alfons Maria Mucha never stopped. And neither should we.